Hello everyone and welcome to another video. If there's anything that the guests in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 and Classic are famous for, is that they are absolutely god-awful at pathfinding. Sometimes they get lost in places where there really is just a very easy way out and all you can do is facepalm. However, as well known as their inability to pathfind is, the details of how exactly that pathfinding works are not so well known and they are filled with misconceptions and misunderstandings. The most prominent misunderstood topic is the one of wide paths, which depending on who you ask can range from being perfectly fine to absolutely awful things that will ruin everything. In this video I will explain how exactly the guest pathfinding works and will do a variety of experiments to see what the real impacts of wide paths and other things are. This is the most complicated video I have ever made and it has taken dozens of hours of research and testing. I mean, just look at this, I have over 70 save files starting with the word pathfinding, all for this video. And there are also some more that have a different name which are not showing up here. It was all worth it in order to finally properly understand this topic though, and I really hope you enjoy this video. Guests have two different modes of operation when pathfinding. They are either heading for a specific location, which is something we'll discuss later, or they are wandering around randomly. Although, as we're used to by now with this game, randomly doesn't just mean that they'll pick a random direction on every junction and call it a day. No, there's actually quite a bit more to it. Firstly, when they arrive at a junction and have a choice, they have a 50% chance of heading straight on, if that's possible. If the dice rolls on the other 50%, then they'll make a random choice of which path to take. That means that in this situation 75% of the guests will not take the exit. First, there's that 50% that deliberately chooses to go straight on, and for the other half of the guests it's now a 50-50 chance of which path they pick, causing another 25% to head straight on and leaving only the last quarter to take the exit. If it's a four-way junction, then 2/3 or 67% of the guests will head straight on, while the exits each only get a sixth or 17%. The only way to make guests pick exits fairly is to make it a T-junction, where there is no path going forward. Theoretically, there's nothing stopping the guests from turning around and going back to where they came from at the junction, but when wandering around aimlessly, they will never do that. Okay, this all seems easy enough, but not all paths are equal. Take this four-way junction for example. You'd expect most people to go straight on, as we have just learned that that's how it works. Yet very few of them actually do, and instead most of them take one of the side exits. This is because the path straight on is a dead end, and guests tend to avoid dead ends. When deciding which direction to go in, they will first look at which of those are dead ends, and then not count these as valid directions when choosing a path. The question now is, what counts as a dead end? This is any path that has no junctions before ending. We, as normal humans, would realistically consider both of these options dead ends, but because they end in a loop there is a junction and therefore both directions are valid and not dead ends. If we remove a path piece so that one of them is no longer a complete loop, then almost all the guests will go the other way, as this one is now a dead end. If we do the same on the other side, then now both are dead ends. If this is the case where there are no valid options, then we loop back and everything counts again, which means splitting evenly. A path doesn't need to contain a loop to have a junction, by the way, just adding a single path somewhere along the line is enough. Okay, but why do some guests still walk the other way? Who are these free-thinking anarchists that will go against everyone else? Well, there is a small chance, about 3.3%, that the guests will refuse to ignore dead ends and count every direction as valid. So in this case, that means that out of 1,000 guests, roughly 33 will consider both sides, of which then half will go onto the dead end. If we drown all the other guests to see how many took the dead end, we get 17, which is exactly the number we expected. Interestingly, guests that are holding food or drink always don't care about dead ends, so if we give everyone ice cream, they will split evenly again, despite one direction being a dead end while the other isn't. The current reasoning for this given in the OpenRCT2 code is that guests that are consuming something don't pay very much attention to where they're going. But the original intention might also have been that guests with food and drink will be able to go into the little dead ends with benches like this and sit down to eat or drink whatever they've bought. Alright, let's go back to what counts as a valid path. So far we've only looked at junctions where one path splits into two, but you can introduce a junction in other ways as well. If you put a stall or right entrance on the path, that also introduces a junction, and now the path is no longer a dead end and everyone will head that way. But what if we put it on the end? This is technically a dead end, but of course we do want the guests to go to the right and not into the other one, which is a dead end. Luckily the game is smart enough to consider that, and any dead end with a right entrance or queue line on the end is counted as a valid direction. Right exits are not counted though, which is why guests will only rarely walk into exit lines. This is why, at least for these purposes, you don't need to bother with no entry signs on simple right exit paths, as almost all of the guests will ignore them anyway. However, as soon as you introduce a junction by combining two exit paths into one or putting a stall somewhere along it, then you do need a no entry sign to stop the guests from going into it. Seriously, just look at this. Currently there are very few guests walking into this exit line, but as soon as I build another exit on it, they start swarming in. And then again, as soon as I remove it, they stop, because once again, it's now a dead end. And lastly, what about stalls? Do they, on the end of a dead end, count as a destination? Yes, they do, but I believe this was bugged in the vanilla game. If we put a stall on a dead end, then in OpenRCT2 the guests will treat it as a valid direction and flock to it. However, if we open this very same save file in the vanilla game, the onslaught will mostly dry up and far fewer guests will head for it. Initially I thought that guests simply never considered stalls on dead ends to be valid destinations, but that's not quite the case. From doing various tests I have calculated that there's about a 20% chance that guests consider stalls a valid destination in the vanilla game, as opposed to a 100% chance in OpenRCT2. But why would I think that this is a bug and not just something that OpenRCT2 changed? Well, this is because in RCT Classic this is also changed. In Classic the guests always treat stalls as valid destinations, just like in OpenRCT2. The impacts of this are actually very significant. In this cute little park there's a balloon stall in the middle that's on the side of one of the paths. Guests never specifically head for balloon stalls, so they can only buy a balloon if they accidentally bump into a stall. What is the chance that they will do that here? Well, let's calculate it. The moment a guest enters the red tile, they have to make a choice where to go. In OpenRCT2 and RCT Classic, both directions are always valid, in which case all guests have a 75% chance they'll continue straight on and a 25% chance they'll take the exit and bump into the stall, potentially buying a balloon. In vanilla, it's different. There's about a 20% chance that it'll play out the same way, but in the other 80% they do not count it as a valid direction and only ever head straight on. Of that 20%, there's again a 75% chance of heading straight on and a 25% chance of taking the exit, meaning that the guests here only have a roughly 5% chance of bumping into the balloon stall in the vanilla game when they pass it, 5 times less than in OpenRCT2 and Classic. To see the actual consequences of this, I ran this park for 2 years in OpenRCT2, RCT Classic and RCT2 Vanilla. In OpenRCT2 it sold a little over 1100 balloons in these 2 years, and Classic had very similar numbers. In Vanilla though, it's only 367, a third of the previous amount. You might expect it to be 5 times lower instead of 3 times lower, but that's not quite the case, as in Vanilla the chance that a guest that bumps into the balloon stall does not have a balloon yet is higher, but a third is still a lot less. This kind of confirms a thing that I've been noticing, which I don't remember seeing when I was a kid, and that is when you place a balloon stall, now it will be crawling with balloons absolutely everywhere in no time, while in the original game this effect was far smaller. As we discussed at the start of the video and briefly again here, at any particular junction guests have a much larger chance of continuing straight on if that is a valid direction. You can abuse this behavior to make the guests buy more souvenirs. Here I have a balloon stall on a right exit path, and it's located in such a way that at the junction the guests have a 75% chance of bumping into the balloon stall after having ridden the ride. Or actually that goes for the people who didn't immediately decide to go on the ride again. Those guests now now have a place they want to go, and then none of what we've discussed so far goes, as this is all about guests who are just wandering around aimlessly. After 2 years of operation, this balloon stall has sold 325 balloons. If we instead put the stall one tile further along and turn it into a side exit, there's only a 25% chance that the guests will bump into it, and this time it sold only 146 balloons after 2 years, less than half. Even though guests have a lower chance to consider stalls a valid direction in vanilla, the same behavior of being more likely to head straight on does exist, so this strategy works there too. You can do the same with rides. Here I have 2 mazes, one on a corner and one next to a corner. The corner maze achieves about 6,500 guests per hour, while the other one is stuck at about 40% of that with less than 3,000 guests an hour. A very practical example of this behavior would be my Infernal Views speedrun. In this run I built 2 launched freefalls to make a lot of money very quickly so that I could afford the 10 coasters you need for the goal. Originally I used to build 3 escape hatches randomly on the path, but when I switched to building them in such a way that the queue line is straight on from a junction, I only needed 2 and still made more money than I did with 3. There's one big question mark remaining, and that is wide paths. How do they work? Why do guests stick to just one side of a double path, and why do they only walk in very specific rows and columns of a big plaza? Well, not doing this would make pathfinding much more resource intensive, and it would make guests that are wandering around aimlessly often walk in circles. To prevent that, the game suppresses a lot of the path tiles in order to turn the network into single wide paths again. OpenRST2 allows you to see which path pieces are suppressed. First, enable the debug tools in the options, and then click on the gears, open the paint debug window and enable show wide paths. With this enabled, the game will highlight any suppressed path pieces as white. Now we can see what the path system looks like according to the game, and it's really just a few single white paths and not much else. These white path pieces will not be used by any guests when trying to pathfind somewhere, and they are counted as invalid directions when guests are wandering about. There is still a surprising amount of guests on the white path pieces though, and we can explain that. Here for example, there is a dead end of unsuppressed paths, with both directions being suppressed. In this case, every direction counts as valid again, so all the guests that will go into this dead end have a 50-50 chance of going left or right. The reason guests are going into this dead end in the first place is that it's not a real dead end, as on every tile of it there is a junction with 2 suppressed path pieces to the side. Since these suppressed tiles are invalid, they will almost always head straight on until they reach the end, where they are forced to go left or right. There is of course also that rebellious 3.3% chance for a guest to ignore invalid paths entirely and go wherever they please. By the way, it's not that 3.3% of the guests always do this, but rather that every guest has a 3.3% chance to do this at every junction. You may remember that guests that are eating food also go wherever, and if I suddenly give everyone ice cream, we can see that in effect. They stop being confined to a few narrow corridors and basically spread out over the entire plaza. Whatever kind of path layout you have, the game will turn it into a bunch of single paths the best it can, while still allowing guests to access everything that connects to it. On longer stretches of wide path, the game will also include a path to the other side every now and then in order to prevent the guests from having to walk a very long way around. Sometimes these wide paths can result in weird pathfinding behaviors. For example, why are a lot of guests walking into this exit path? Weren't they supposed to ignore that? Well, when a guest gets to this red path piece, the path to the left is not a dead end, as on the very next piece, the black one, there's immediately a junction again. So a portion of the guests will head into that direction. Then, on that black path piece, the options are a suppressed path piece and an exit path. Since both options are invalid, the standard rules kick in, which means that the guests have a 75% chance of going straight on into the exit path and a 25% chance to take the left onto the white suppressed piece. This isn't just a one-off rare thing, it happens rather easily. For example, if we build this merry-go-round and connect the paths like this, we get exactly the same situation. It's not a massive problem, but it is a small downside of using wide paths. Another downside of wide paths is Handyman. Handyman don't have any pathfinding and just walk around randomly. This means that even though most of the litter and vomit will be on the single wide path created by the game, as that's where most of the guests are, you need more handymen to cover your path as they walk wherever they please, and that costs more money. This is going to be a running theme with wide paths. They are not terrible and usually don't ruin your park, but there are a couple of downsides which can have pretty big impact, as we will see later, and they have pretty much no upsides apart from looking pretty. Aside from aesthetics, the main reason you would want to use wider paths is to reduce overcrowding, but since guests don't use them properly, that doesn't really work. There are some guests that are on the other side, but not a lot. If overcrowding is your primary concern, then you should build a fence in the middle first so that the two paths are not connected, in which case guests will use both sides as they're both normal single wide paths. Although in some situations you need to be careful with this too, for reasons we'll come to later. Wide paths working decently well only goes for RCT2, RCT Classic and OpenRCT2 by the way. In RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 you definitely do not want to ever use wide paths, as guests can just not navigate them at all. Guests are not always on a path though. Sometimes they are on grass because you once again forgot to build an exit path. In this case there isn't really any pathfinding at all. The guests just move in a completely random direction every tile, which includes the possibility of going backwards. If they're next to a path tile, they have the possibility to move onto it, but there is no guarantee that they will. Yeah, they're not very smart. Tiles can also be blocked. Guests cannot walk up or down cliffs, and they also cannot walk into water because they would drown. Track pieces and some scenery items also block guests. They cannot walk through fences and walls, and they cannot walk onto tiles with small or large scenery items. Quarter tile scenery items are perfectly fine though, and guests will just ignore them. In OpenRCT2 there is a new category of scenery items for this purpose, and that is very small yet full tile scenery objects. This allows guests to walk over full tile objects that are very low, like flower beds, roofs, base blocks, lily pads and more, which they cannot do in RCT2 Vanilla and Classic. Lastly, guests will ignore any track or scenery item that blocks a tile if all directions are blocked off and they're trapped on just a single tile. In this case they can escape. The same doesn't go for cliffs though. A single raised tile will trap them forever. When guests are walking around, you can sometimes see them taking out their map, if they have one, and looking at it. While it would make sense that this indicates that they have a hard time pathfinding or are lost or something, this is not the case and it's actually entirely random. If they arrive at a junction with at least 2 valid directions to pick from, there's a 1 in 40 chance that they will check their map when wandering around randomly, and a 1 in 7 chance to do it, so much more frequently, when they are navigating somewhere. Speaking of navigating paths, so far we have only talked about what guests do when they are not specifically heading somewhere, but now the time has come to see how they get from where they are now to where they want to go. Often, when explaining these kinds of topics, like what I did in the first half of this video, I go over exactly how the code works, but I won't be doing that now for 2 reasons. The first is that it's really quite long and complicated. This isn't just a simple calculation, but rather a very computationally intensive search, and all kinds of optimizations are used to make it faster, but also more complicated. The other reason is that I only have the OpenRCT2 source code available to me, and it works differently there from RCT2 and Classic, which by the way work the exact same as each other. The pathfinding in OpenRCT2 is much better actually, as guests get lost far less frequently there. I have gone through all the pathfinding code in OpenRCT2, and using that combined with dozens of experiments that I ran in RCT2 Vanilla, RCT Classic and OpenRCT2, I will explain how the pathfinding works in practice and what you can do to avoid guests getting lost. When a guest has picked a place to go, a pathfinding algorithm kicks into gear and tries to pick the best direction to go in. In theory, this could search the entire park and always find its destination as long as there's a path going between the two. But that requires way too many calculations, and in any sizable park the game would grind to a halt. Therefore, there is a maximum to how far the game will search. When a guest wants to go to a right or stall, it searches no further than 5 path junctions, or 7 if the guest has a map. So yeah, maps do actually improve their pathfinding abilities, and you should always build an information kiosk if you can. If the guest is heading for the park exit, it will by default always search 7 junctions, regardless of whether they have a map, which increases to 8 if they can't find the exit and get lost. Mechanics also need to pathfind in order to be able to find and fix or inspect a ride, and their limit is 8 junctions as well. It might be possible that these numbers are slightly different in vanilla or classic, but from my experiments they seem to be the same. But what counts as a junction? This is a bit confusing as it's different from what we saw earlier for the aimless wandering around, as this time we want to ignore all rides and stalls and only care about getting closer to our destination. Therefore, any queue line, entrance building, exit building or stall that is connected to the path does not create a junction. For pathfinding purposes, this is a completely straight junctionless path. What does count is whenever the path splits in two, and it does not matter if one of them is a dead end. This path has a junction every few tiles, despite them being tiny dead ends. However, if we put no entry signs in front of them, the junctions disappear, so putting these in front of your exit paths will help your guests pathfind around your park, as they can now search further. This is not always necessary, but later on in this video we will see situations where it absolutely helps you out. For wider paths it does work the same as before. The game compresses it into a bunch of single paths by suppressing all the ones that are marked in white here. Now that we know what a junction is, let's see how the search actually works. Basically, the game checks every possible path starting on the tile that the guest is on until it has hit the limit for the number of junctions. These guests are all lost and looking for the park exit, so the game will search up to 8 junctions away, which is roughly up to here. It then checks the location of every path piece that it has searched, selects the one that is closest to the destination and sends the guest in the direction that has the least amount of steps getting to that path piece. That is why they cannot find the park exit here. The tiles closest to the destination are the ones on the very end of the path, and they cannot pathfind the long way around to get to the exit as there are too many junctions in the way. However, if we start removing junctions, then at some point the exit is within 8 junctions and suddenly the guest can find it without any issues. I will be doing nearly all of the demonstrations of how pathfinding works with guests that want to leave the park. If they're trying to find a ride or stall, then eventually they will just give up and go back to wandering around, which is useful, but it also makes it difficult to show the pathfinding in action. They never give up when trying to go home though, so that does work nicely. Because of how the pathfinding works, the guests don't need to be able to find the ride or whatever they're heading for immediately. 8 junctions isn't a lot, and 5 is even less, but that's fine, because as long as they can find a path piece that is closer to it, they'll just head that way and scan again when they get to the next junction. This leads to some interesting behavior. Again, we have a bunch of lost guests, and when I add a dead end here that goes closer to the exit, it doesn't do anything because it's too many junctions away and the pathfinding algorithm doesn't reach it. However, if I now add another dead end halfway in between the two, they suddenly can find the exit and leave the park. How does this work? Well, from their circle of death they can reach the first dead end, and since it goes closer to the park exit they will be heading for it. But by the time they're close to going on this dead end, they can now also find the second dead end in their search, and as that gets even closer to the exit they will want to go there now. And again, when they've almost reached it, they're now close enough to the park exit to find it and they will leave the park that way. You can see similar behavior when there are multiple park entrances and guests are trying to leave. They always pick the closest park entrance to leave through, even if there is no path going to it. That means that in a situation like this, they get stuck trying to reach the unreachable exit, even though they could easily pathfind to the other one. However, since they check which entrance is the closest on every junction, they will switch to another entrance if they happen to move closer to that one while trying to reach the first one. There is another limit to the pathfinding other than the number of junctions, and that is 200 steps per direction from where the guest is. Take a look at this setup. The guests have to choose between 2 paths, one of which leads to the park exit and one of which gets very close to it. There is only 1 junction in the entire park, so they can naturally find the exit without any issues. However, if we put that junction a bit further back, then suddenly they take the wrong path that doesn't reach the park exit. That's because now the path between the junction and the park exit is more than 200 tiles long, and the algorithm cannot get all the way to the exit. In this case they regress to picking the path which gets them closer to the exit at the end of those 200 scanned tiles, and that's the wrong path here. This may seem like it can cause a lot of issues, but honestly I can't think of how this would ever be a problem without deliberately building a setup to force it happen like I did here. 200 tiles is nearly the length of a maximum size map, so if this goes wrong it's really your own fault for having these extremely long dead ends. There's also a maximum for the total number of path tiles checked, which is 15,000, but this also shouldn't be an issue. Maybe the game does hit this limit occasionally in big parks with lots of junctions everywhere, but unless you're doing something very wrong, it will have found a path tile in the right direction already anyway. Remember, the guests don't necessarily need to find their destination immediately, they just need to find a path tile that is closer to it. But what about height? How well do guests navigate parks with multiple levels where paths go over and under each other? Well, I have this park with a lot of height difference and a number of paths that cross over at different levels, so let's see how it functions. In OpenRCT 2 it has no issues at all, but what about the vanilla game? Here it is also fine, and I already knew it would be since I built this park in 2013, before OpenRCT 2 ever existed, and back then there were no issues, so there would be no issues now as well. There is a limit to what you can get away with though. This park from 2021 has even more complicated path, and while I can't open it in vanilla for whatever reason, RCT Classic is happy to receive it, but the guests are not happy to be in Classic. Again, the pathfinding was fine in OpenRCT 2, but this time in Classic and Vanilla they can get lost in the back of the park, unable to find the exit. Although I'm not sure height is actually to blame, the problem here is really that I just don't have enough connections, leading to a lot of situations where guests need to pass a lot of junctions in the wrong direction to get closer to their goal. If I delete a few rides and use that space to create one more connection, they suddenly can find the exit. The way this height-based pathfinding works is that guests simply take the height into account when determining how close a path tile is to their goal. Take this situation for example. The guests all want to leave, so their goal is the tile in front of the park exit. They can't get there, but there is a path tile above it and another path tile next to it. Which one of these is closer? If the height difference is 7 units or less, the one above it is considered closer and they will head that way. If it is more than 7 units, the tile next to it is closer and they'll go that way instead. You don't really have to worry about this too much as long as you build enough path connections though. If two paths cross over each other, then guests should be able to get from one level to the other within 7 junctions to keep them from getting lost. This is where it may help to block off some exit paths with no entry signs. In this park, the guests are getting trapped above the park exit because it's too many junctions to go around. But if I block off all these spiral slide exits, then suddenly they can find it. In reality though, height isn't to blame. This situation is exactly the same as the one from earlier. Just like how here one extra logical connection solves all the issues, the same goes for the park where they're trapped above the exit. You may notice that I did some of these demonstrations in the vanilla game as opposed to OpenRCT 2 as I usually do. That is because, as I've briefly already mentioned, in OpenRCT 2 the guests are much better at pathfinding. There is still this same pathfinding algorithm that searches the junctions, but in addition to that, guests also remember the last 4 junctions they have visited and will only try directions from those that they haven't tried yet. In this situation from earlier, that leads to about a quarter of the guests finding the exit immediately and the rest getting stuck in a very different place. Why they get stuck exactly there, I don't know, but it most likely has something to do with them remembering those junctions. I'm also not really sure why only a portion of the guests remain stuck while the other ones can find the exit, but I am willing to bet that has something to do with where exactly the guests were when I opened this park in OpenRCT 2 and released this better algorithm upon them. The fact that they get stuck closer to the park entrance now also means that if I delete 2 junctions right after opening the save, they can all find the exit almost immediately, while deleting the same 2 pieces of path in the vanilla game doesn't do anything. There appears to still be some sort of function in vanilla that causes them to try other directions, as they've spread out over 3 path circles instead of just the one closest to the park exit, but it's not nearly as powerful as whatever is exactly happening in OpenRCT 2. Back in OpenRCT 2, it can get really confusing sometimes. If I add 1 path piece right here, suddenly only a few guests can find the exit instead of nearly 300. But if I then also add another 2 pieces at the very end, making the dead end longer, then slowly over time everyone can find the exit for some reason. It's truly confusing sometimes how this works in OpenRCT 2, but guests can always pathfind better here than in RCT Classic and Vanilla. In all my tests, I haven't found a single situation where guests did get lost in open while they didn't in the other two, while the other way around happened all the time. Another such example is this. Here it's more than 8 junctions to the park exit, but there is a junction free path that goes to exactly above the park exit. If I release the guests in Vanilla or Classic, they will go to the right, as that is the direction in which the pathfinding algorithm can get the closest to the park exit. They are now stuck in this park, unable to find the exit. In OpenRCT2 though, the guests straight up walk in the correct direction and can find the park exit without any issues. How these kinds of minutiae of the pathfinding exactly work doesn't really matter, as the strategy to prevent people from getting stuck remains the same. Don't build path constructions where the guests need to pass a lot of junctions in the wrong direction to get somewhere. This example is of course carefully crafted so that I could do all these demonstrations, and it's painfully obvious what's wrong, but you can also do this in more subtle ways. This is Six Flags Belgium, a lovely park centered around a lake, and I see a perfect little bit of land for a nice food court here. Brilliant! Except for the fact that some guests have gotten stuck here and cannot find the park exit, because it's a long way in the wrong direction and the pathfinding algorithm doesn't reach far enough to go all the way around. However, while it's easy to blame me for building this setup in this location and not building an extra connection like this, we could also arguably blame wide paths for this. If we remove a bunch of path pieces here, turning some of the wide paths into a single path, then guests suddenly can find the park exit. This is because wide paths can introduce extra junctions, reducing the reach of the pathfinding algorithm. It's not exactly clear to me where those junctions are in this case. We can use OpenRCT2 to look at which path tiles are suppressed, but I'm not sure whether that algorithm works the exact same here as it does in Vanilla. Whichever tiles are exactly the cause, the fact is that turning this double path into a single path solves the pathfinding issues we have. That's not necessary in OpenRCT2 though, as there the guests can find the park exit just fine, which is again an example of OpenRCT2 having better pathfinding. The route that they're taking to the exit is incredibly inefficient though, it's at least twice as long as the most direct route. So while wide paths didn't make them get lost in OpenRCT2 here, it did make the pathfinding much less efficient. An easier way to see the extra junctions introduced by wide paths is on a very long straight one. The guests mostly stick to one side, apart from the odd rule-defying free-thinking anarchist, but every bunch of tiles suddenly a whole lot of guests do take the plunge to the other side, which is because those are the paths that are not suppressed. In this setup, Vanilla and Open do behave the exact same, so the suppression algorithms are quite similar if not identical, but again I'm not sure. Another example is this park that has nothing but wide paths, including a whole bunch of massive plazas. I built this park in OpenRCT2 and all was fine, and in Vanilla the guests seem to have no issues pathfinding around this park either, except for one place. Right here, very close to the park exit, guests are getting lost because apparently there's just a few junctions too many for the guests to pathfind the long way around to the exit. If we remove a bunch of paths and extend 2 queue lines to turn it into a proper single path, then suddenly they can find the exit. Of course, this is also solvable with an extra path connection so that they don't have to walk in the wrong direction in the first place. On closer inspection, this isn't the only problem though. When I was editing this video and recording the footage you just saw, I randomly clicked on a guest that was heading for the orange looping coaster, but couldn't find it and was stuck on the other side. You could build a path through the coaster to solve this, but I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, as this looks like a reasonable path layout to me. They do eventually give up on trying to find it, so a problem like this is harder to spot, but it is still a problem as they do lose a significant amount of happiness when they cannot find something. And it still doesn't stop, as there's also this mechanic here, which is trying to get to the red coaster at the bottom of the screen, but is stuck in the queue line of the blue coaster. Mechanics use the same pathfinding algorithm as the guests, so wide paths make them less efficient too. Eventually they will give up, and if another mechanic is now closer by, they will get the job instead. But in the meantime, this is actively hindering your park, as a ride is broken down for an extended period of time, especially if the same mechanic gets called over and over again. I built a second park with just wide paths to see if they would again cause issues, and this time I used Empty Airfield, as that one comes with a whole lot of massive paths. Just like before, it was perfectly fine in OpenRCT2, but not in Vanilla and Classic. Actually, once again, I couldn't open this in vanilla for whatever reason, but in classic I can, and they're the same anyway. There's a bunch of guests trapped in this airplane hangar trying to get to the orange twister coaster behind it, but they cannot find it. It's not even that long a way around, and if we turn just a small section of double path into a single path, they can all of a sudden find it just fine. And that's again the story of wide paths. If your park is designed really well, then they most likely aren't gonna cause any problems. But once your path layout is a bit suboptimal, you'll run into issues quicker when you're using wide paths. I did also find a situation where even in OpenRCT2 guests can struggle with navigating these wider paths. I am currently working on this park and all the main paths in it are 2 tiles wide. I don't have very many toilets in this park, only 2, and that's causing some issues as guests aren't able to find them. I constantly get messages about guests not being able to find toilets and them being lost because of it. The park still functions fine and these guests that cannot find the toilets will eventually give up and hopefully be closer to one when they try again, but it's not ideal. If I reduce this park to just single paths, then the messages about the guests not being able to find the toilet stop and the one about them being lost become much less frequent. Lesson 1 is that I really do need more toilets, but lesson 2 is that in a more organic shape, the amount of junctions introduced by wide paths can really hamper the pathfinding algorithm. Let's say a guest wants to travel through this section around the lake, going from one of the grey path pieces to the other. In the single paths version, there are just 2 junctions in between, highlighted with the brightly colored paths. One is from a right exit line and the other is from a little dead end that's there because I thought it looks nice. Now let's see where the junctions are with the original double paths, and wow, that's a lot. There's a total of 20 junctions here, of which 18 are caused by the fact that the path is now more than 1 tile wide. When a wide path changes directions, you can get some extra junctions, and in long gentle curves like here, there's a lot of that. Look at this, here there's even 6 in a row, and removing that little decorative black path piece only gets rid of one of them. The changes in height that the landscape has makes this even worse. Paths cannot connect sideways when on a hill, so every time a wide path goes up a slope, it splits in 2 and creates 2 extra junctions. It can get even worse. I found this section where the path goes flat for 3 tiles in between 2 hills, and none of these gets suppressed, resulting in 6 junctions in the middle, 2 on the top and another one at the bottom. To get through this section, the pathfinding algorithm has to pass through at least 5 junctions compared to only 1 if it were a single path. To see the impact of this on the entire park, I counted all the junctions in both versions. The single path park has a total of 35 junctions, while the double paths park has exactly 4 times as many, with a grand total of 140 junctions. This number seems scary and it does hamper the reach of the pathfinding algorithm, but I also want to remind you that if I just added an extra toilet or 2, there would be no pathfinding issues in this park at all. The takeaway is not that wide paths are bad, but rather that they will cause issues quicker when something else is not optimal. I have shown some issues caused by wide paths, especially in Classic and Vanilla, but those were in big parks with tons of wide paths everywhere, and for the most part they were completely fine. Although while guests can navigate wide paths well enough to usually not get completely lost in RCT2 and Classic, it's a whole other story in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1. They are not guaranteed to give issues, but very frequently they do. This Dynamite Dunes is a bit chaotic as RCT1 doesn't seem to narrow down the paths at all, but the guests are not getting lost. However, in this Arid Heights, guests very quickly got lost, and this loser is just walking back and forth on the green path very close to the park exit that she's trying to reach. In RCT2 with the same setup she can find it just fine, but not in RCT1 where her mind is very much inferior still. So, what's the conclusion on wide paths? In RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 you should avoid them like the plague, as they'll very often cause major problems. In RCT2 and Classic they are mostly fine if you design your path layout well, but on occasion they can cause significant issues and prevent guests from finding their destinations. And lastly, in OpenRCT2 they are very unlikely to cause any game-breaking issues, but they can still make it harder for the guests to navigate the park, especially if your path layout follows a more organic organic shape and has a lot of small elevation changes. Even though I did not encounter any guests being trapped in the park due to wide paths in OpenRCT 2 during normal gameplay, I did discover one hilarious way to abuse wide paths and the idiocy of the guests to trap them. Six Flags Holland has this big plaza at the front, which looks scary, but guests can pathfind on it perfectly fine. But if you place a no entry sign right here, then suddenly they cannot find the exit anymore, despite there being plenty of room to go around it. This is because I put the sign on the single path that the game compresses this to, so according to the guests there is no valid path to the park exit, even though for any sane person there obviously would be. If you're using just single path, you can still run into pathfinding issues, but if you do, there is definitely a problem with your layout. For example, this Evergreen Gardens has nothing that would classically be called a dead end, but if you look carefully, the only way to go from the front half to the back half is one path all the way on this side of the park. This causes a lot of guests to get stuck here, while for example trying to find the corkscrew coaster on the other side. In this case, I would call the entire back half of the park a dead end, and the solution is to build more connections, which were already there, but I removed them so that I could use this park to make this point in this video. As we've seen, blocking the exit paths of your rides can help as well to reduce the number of junctions, but if you design your layout well, this should not be necessary. I rarely ever do it, and guests almost never get lost in my parks. My strategy is to always connect every path back to another path and have no dead ends, especially not massive ones like the one we just saw in Evergreen Gardens. They're not always a problem though. For example, this food court with some benches on it could be called a dead end, but it's on the edge of the park and there's nothing behind it for the guests to pathfind to, so it's perfectly fine. There are also loads of small dead ends from exit paths in this park, but there are enough path connections that no matter which direction guests want to go in, they can pathfind past these exit lines just fine. If you have very long paths with loads of long exit lines between two junctions, then it might be an issue if they're not blocked off, but on a small scale like this they're not a problem at all, and since banners can be a bit ugly, I prefer to keep these open. Some people like to have a path system like this, with a tiny grid. It's basically a wide path with a lot of holes in it, and as opposed to real wide paths, these will actually battle overcrowding as guests will use both sides. They can navigate this perfectly fine, but since you are introducing a lot of junctions, you have to be extra careful to make sure that you minimize the distance that guests have to walk in the wrong direction to get somewhere they want to go. A funny thing I realized while making this video is that guests can theoretically also get lost when trying to find the park entrance before they've entered the park, or when trying to find the edge of the map after they have left the park. They use the same pathfinding algorithm then, so if you make a stupid, complicated entry path like this, they will absolutely get stuck and not be able to enter the park. This is even more hilarious in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1. Blackpool Pleasure Beach has a short little dead end going the other way next to the park entrance, and when guests have left the park, there's a good chance that they'll head that way before realizing they've been an idiot and need to go the other way. And when they pass the entrance again, they might even bump into it, trying to enter the park again, which they cannot do because their goal is to find the edge of the map. So, to summarize this video, to prevent guests from getting lost in your parks, you should avoid any significant dead ends, which I do by always looping every path back to another path that's close by. Guests pathfind via junctions, so really the thing to avoid is having situations where guests would need to walk past a lot of junctions in the wrong direction to get somewhere. Wide paths are mostly fine, but in RCT2 Vanilla and RCT Classic they do sometimes cause issues if your path layout is suboptimal and make guests get lost, which is a result of these wide paths introducing extra junctions. In OpenRCT2 the guests are better at navigating wide paths and other suboptimal layouts, but they can still make your park less efficient and cause minor issues. If you want the absolute smallest chance to encounter pathfinding problems, stick to just single paths. And finally, guests prefer to go straight ahead when walking through a junction, which you can take advantage of by placing your stalls and connecting your queue lines in such a way that guests will bump into them when going straight ahead. And that was everything you need to know about pathfinding in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, RollerCoaster Tycoon Classic and OpenRCT2. I hope you found it interesting and that you learned something new. To learn how to make the most money, you can click this video right here. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.